Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Wednesday Wars. Of course, it's not called Chapter 2. It's called October, as we kind of walk through Hauling Hood's school year. We went through September. Now we're heading into October. And the funny thing about September is, while we know that it's called the Wednesday Wars, we didn't really get a taste of what happened in the September Wednesdays. So we're actually going to find that out in October. So keep that in mind when we think about time passing. We're starting off October, actually going backwards a little bit so that we can kind of build up to whatever happens in October. Of course, we learned about Mr. Hauling Hood, our main character. He's telling the story first person narrative. He doesn't know everything. This isn't him talking from the future. This is him in the moment telling us what happens. He uses hyperbole like he breathes. Everything that he talks about seems to be full of exaggeration. So we don't know what's 100% true and what's not. We know Mrs. Baker either hates him or has something else going on. We found out that her husband is in the army or in the military. I think the army, going with the 101st over to Vietnam.
From out of the skies over Vietnam come the Screaming Eagles, the heroic paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. Their fabled exploits during World War II can never be forgotten. In December 1944, outnumbered and surrounded by the Germans at Bastogne, the men of the 101st courageously fought on. When the Germans ordered them to surrender or be annihilated, their acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave the historic reply, "Nuts," and they stood until the Germans were defeated. It is in this same tradition that the men of the Screaming Eagles, 1st Brigade, today serve on the jungle battlefront of Vietnam.
We know that she may or may not hate him. She's up to something on Wednesdays, we just don't know what. And that big giant sentence that she used to diagram when all the other kids got easy sentences. Is she trying to get after him because she doesn't like him, or does she see something in him that maybe he doesn't see in himself? We know about Merrill Lee, who apparently has a crush on Hauling, but we got the information from Hauling, so maybe not. We know that Doug Switek is he of many, many plans on how to get at teachers. We know that Doug Switek has a brother, and we don't know his name. We just know him as Doug Switek's brother. We know about mom and dad, Hauling's mom and dad. Mom doesn't really think for herself too much, and dad doesn't really think about Hauling per se, except if he's going to screw up a potential job for him, like the Baker Sporting Emporium. So we've learned about a lot, and Danny Huffer, who we think is Hauling's best friend. We've got a bunch of colorful characters. We just got introduced to them. Let's dive into October and see if we can find out a little bit more. Hopefully you notice this book is full of humor. I hope that it's coming across as I read it to you. There's so much more to come. Here we go. October. The Wednesdays of September passed in a cloudy haze of chalk dust. Foreshadowing. At 1:45, the bus arrived from Temple Bethel to spring half of my class. Those are the Jewish kids in his class going to Hebrew class. At 1:55, the bus arrived from St. Adalbert's to spring the other half. Even my T, who had to go to catechism since it was a Catholic relief agency that brought her over from Vietnam. And I guess they figured that she owed them, even though she wasn't Catholic. So we did learn that there was a humanitarian effort on the part of someone from the United States. Now we know it's the Catholic Church, who is sort of helping out the people from Vietnam in need, especially after the United States has gone over there to fight in a war, a conflict. It's a complicated affair. Then Mrs. Baker and I sat alone, facing each other. The classroom clock ticked off the minutes. Do you hear something? She was probably considering what she could legally do to remind me how regrettable it was that my family was Presbyterian. I Hyperbole. There's no point in teaching you something new, she said. You just hear it a second time tomorrow. So that first Wednesday, I washed all the chalkboards. Then I straightened the Thorndike dictionaries. Then I washed all the chalkboards again since they were streaky. Then I went outside and pounded erasers against the brick wall of Camillo Jr. High until the white chalk dust spread up and around me, settling in my hair and in my eyes and up my nose and down my throat.
We've been going about this all wrong. I blame myself.
So that I figured I was probably going to end up with some sort of lung disease that would kill me before the end of the school year, all because I happen to be Presbyterian. Hyperbole. The second Wednesday of September and the third and the fourth and Wednesdays on into October were pretty much the same. I got good at the chalkboard, so Mrs. Baker added putting up her bulletin boards with microscopic pins and leveling tools, hyperbole, and sweeping down the cobwebs from the asbestos tiles on the ceiling and wiping the grimy, sweaty hands of the lower half of the windows, then pushing them all up so that Mrs. Baker said fresh air could circulate into the classroom. Foreshadowing. Which it really needed, since once air reached the coat room, it landed on all the stuff from all the lunches that had been chucked into the corners because they were too vile. Vocabulary. They were too vile to eat even when they were fresh. Lunches like liverwurst sandwiches. I like liverwurst. Does that mean I'm old? It's made by Schmidt, so. So after I got good at the windows, Mrs. Baker got me cleaning out the coat room. But what I didn't clean out was the stash that Doug Switek was hiding to prepare for number 166. So far, there was a box of tapioca pudding, a bag of marshmallows that had been smashed into a sticky pulp, a half dozen ragged feathers, a bottle of red ink, and a plastic bag with something awful in it. Probably something dead. He had it all in a small box from the A&P, stuffed on the shelf above the coats. I didn't touch any of it. There's imagery for you. So right now you can start concocting something with all that stuff. Notice he's got these real super long run-on sentences as well. It's hard to read, but fun to read. And do you think I complained about this? Do you think I complained about picking up old lunches that had fungus growing on them and sweeping asbestos tiles and straightening Thorndike dictionaries? No, I didn't. Not once. Not even when I looked out the clean lower windows as the afternoon light of autumn changed to mellow and full yellows and the air turned so sweet and cool that you wanted to drink it. Metaphor. Imagery, beautiful imagery. Think about what you can see and smell and touch, what you can feel, what you can hear. And as people began to burn leaves on the side of the streets and that lovely smoke came into the back of your nose and told you it was autumn. And what were you doing smelling chalk dust and old liverwurst sandwiches instead? And why didn't I complain? There's irony here because he's sort of complaining. Because after the first week in October, the Baker Sporting Emporium narrowed its architect choices to two. Hood and Associates and Kowalski and Associates. Now that's a familiar name, Kowalski. Who Kowalski? Merrill Lee Kowalski. And so every single night after supper, but before Walter Cronkite began reporting, my father said to me, "So, Holling, everything all right with Mrs. Baker?" And I answered, "Just swell." "Keep it that way," he'd say. So I didn't complain. Still, you would have thought that since all this was happening because I was Presbyterian, God would have seen to it that the Yankees would have played in the World Series to pay me back for my persecution. Good vocabulary word. Persecution means like having to go through something really hard. But were they? Of course not. The world isn't fair that way. The Boston Red Sox were playing instead. And let me tell you, everyone knows that the Boston Red Sox are never going to win another World Series. Never. Not even if they have 3 Carl Yastrzemskis, which they don't. Well, the irony is this book was written in 2005 and the Red Sox had just won the World Series. The Yankees, of course, have always been one of the greatest teams of all time. Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, all considered some of the greatest of all time. I grew up in the 70s, and they were a great team then with a man named Reggie Jackson, and they had a great catcher named Thurman Munson. So the Yankees have been great for such a long time. And of course, they live in Long Island, which isn't far from New York. Actually, from New York City, if you look at the map, you can see that it's less than an hour away. So, of course, he's a baseball fan. Carl Yastrzemski was one of the best players in the 60s when the triple...
What a milestone for this guy.
Doug Switek's brother was still not back in school, and Doug Switek told us why. The 10 days of observation had been pure delight for him, but when no one had found any behavior beyond his usual weirdness, he realized that he would be coming back to school again pretty soon. So the evening before he was to return, when he came to his classroom with Miss Switek to meet with his teacher, Doug Switek's brother walked up to the chalkboard and pounded the erasers against his head. Since Mrs. Ledema didn't have someone like me around to pound them against the brick walls every Wednesday afternoon, Doug Switek's brother's hair turned white after about 4 poundings. Then he took 2 long pieces of chalk, stuck them into his mouth like fangs, and went howling and roaring and slobbering out into the hallway. The school was mostly deserted, so it really was just dumb luck that Mrs. Sidman, who had decided to leave her new post in the main administrative office, had come into school that particular evening to clean out the last of her personal effects. I think her screams echoed up and down the halls of Camillo Jr. High until dawn. Hyperbole. That brought Doug Switek's brother another 4 weeks of medical observation. It was pretty clear from Mrs. Baker's glares the next morning that somehow she thought this was all my fault, which it wasn't. I didn't have a thing to do with it, but when someone hates your guts, truth, justice, and the American way don't mean all that much. Does she really hate him? On Wednesday, when we all stood up to go to Mr. Petrelli's geography class, Mrs. Baker stopped glaring. In fact, as we walked out with Geography for You and Me in our hands, she started to smile at me. Then I got worried. She looked like those evil geniuses who suddenly figure out a plan to conquer the world and can already imagine Earth's population quivering in their grasp. Simile. If we were partnered up, I'd tell you to turn and talk to somebody. What's she plotting? So be thinking about that. Why is she smiling at him? It was all I could do not to sprint out of Mrs. Baker's classroom, even though we weren't supposed to run in the halls, to the safe world of junior high geography. Mr. Petrelli believed that no class was worth anything without a study question data sheet. He dittoed those off like major publisher. His hands were always blue from the ink, mostly because he hauled the dittos out from the machine while they were still wet from the alcohol, the smell of which gave the room a tang. Now, a ditto machine sounds like a copy machine. It was kind of the old-fashioned copy machine, and you would put blue ink, and I sort of remember these. All my worksheets as a kid were all purple. You'd put ink on this roller thing, and you'd like roll them through, and I remember my teachers always having these little blue marks on their fingers. Yeah, that's what a ditto machine looks like right there. Really odd. But, you know, before copy machines. Now we've got a copy machine. We throw a copy in and boom, you get it in color, whatever. Fill these out in pairs, he said. You have 43 minutes. 43 minutes. Teachers don't reckon time the way normal people do. When Merrill Lee came over to be my study partner, I was still wondering why Mrs. Baker had smiled. Are you all right? Merrill Lee asked. Just swell. You're holding your pen upside down. Thanks for pointing that out, Detective Kowalski. You're very welcome. Do you think you can figure out the answers while I write them down on the sheet? Why don't you figure out the answers while I write them down on the sheet? Because I don't know how to write. What's the first state? Delaware. Do you think Mrs. Baker looks like an evil genius? Simile. Not unless you're paranoid. Great vocabulary word. He is definitely he's definitely vocabulary. He's definitely paranoid. What's the second state? I'm not paranoid. Pennsylvania. Mrs. Baker hates my guts. Mrs. Baker doesn't hate your guts, and you are too paranoid. What's the third state? Well, thank you for your vote of confidence. New York. Marilee looked over at geography for you and me. New York wasn't the third state. It was New Jersey, not New York. How do you know that? Everybody knows that, she said. Oh, out beyond Mr. Petrelli's not-so-clean lower windows, it was one of those perfect blue autumn days. There's the word perfect. Wonder if that means something good's going to happen or something's bad. When the sun is warm and the grass is still green and the leaves are red and tipped with yellow, a few white clouds drifted high, teased along by a breeze as gentle as a breath. Personification. Twice. See if you can figure out what was personification. What's the fourth state? Said Marilee. That's pretty much how it went for Marilee and me until recess, which had become a whole lot safer since Mrs. Baker's failed assassination plot, hyperbole. I figured that most of her would-be assassins had seen what had happened to Doug Switek's brother and were worried I might take them out too. So when we left Mr. Petrelli and went back to Mrs. Baker's classroom, I believed I could actually run out into the perfect October day and hope to come back alive. I could feel the warm sun on my back already. But then I found out why Mrs. Baker had been smiling. Mr. Hoodhood, she called from her desk as the school clock clicked to noon. I have a quick job for you. Everyone else, enjoy your recess. I looked at Marilee. See, I whispered. You were paranoid, she said, and abandoned me. Mr. Hoodhood, said Mrs. Baker, there are some pastries that Mrs. Biggio, new character, has spent the morning baking for me that need to be brought up to this room. Would you go down to the kitchen and bring them here? And do not start any rumors. These are not for the class. They are for the wives of Vietnam soldiers gathering at St. Albert's this afternoon, not for anyone else. Is that all? I said. Don't look so suspicious, she said. Suspicion is an unbecoming passion. Remember that quote? I'm not going to tell you why. Passion, great vocabulary word. Why do you think she chose Holling? Is it because she doesn't trust him? Is it because she doesn't like him? Why, of all the kids, does she pick Holling to go get these pastries for the wives of Vietnam soldiers, which she obviously is one? That's not something that's not important. And she picked Holling to go do it. He thinks she's up to something. Is that all? He said. And maybe she is? I took my unbecoming passion and I left to find Mrs. Biggio. This didn't seem like it would take too long, even though the 7th grade classrooms were up on the 3rd floor and the kitchen was on the 1st floor at the very end of the hallway, probably so that the wind could blow the fumes away. Sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the halls filled up with the scent of hamburger and pepper surprise. Boy, that sounds good. A scent that lingered like the smell of a dead animal caught underneath the floorboards. Hyperbole. Imagery. Ugh. I think that Mrs. Biggio couldn't smell the scents either because she wore a cotton mask over her face all the time, or because she had worked in the kitchen of Camillo Jr. High for so long that she could no longer smell. Hyperbole. But I didn't have a mask and I could smell. So when I reached the kitchen, I got ready to take a deep breath before I walked in, but then I realized I didn't need to. There were no fumes. There was only the delicate, extravagant, warm, tasty scent of buttery baking crust and of vanilla cream and of powdered sugar still drifting in the heated air and stretched out on the long tables far from whatever surprise was being fed to Camillo Jr. High for the lunch that day were a dozen trays of cream puffs. Brown, light, perfect cream puffs. You should all say that right now with me. Brown, light, perfect cream puffs. Mrs. Baker send you? Said Mrs. Biggio. I nodded. You can start with that one, she said, pointing. I thought, shouldn't Mrs. Biggio be grateful for my willingness to help? Wouldn't any human being with a beating heart hand me one of the brown, say this with me, brown, light, perfect cream puffs Was that so unlikely? I saw you. You didn't say it with me. Let's say it again. Brown, light, perfect cream puffs. Was that so unlikely? Yes, it was unlikely. Now would be a good time to start, said Mrs. Biggio, and don't drop any. I won't drop any, I thought, and you're very welcome. Humor. I picked up a tray in each hand. One tray at a time, said Mrs. Biggio. I looked at her. That will take me 12 trips to the 3rd floor, I said. So, Mr. Samowitz is teaching you some arithmetic after all. Don't drop any. It took me the rest of lunch recess to carry the trays, one at a time, up to the classroom. Mrs. Baker smiled sweetly as I brought each one in. Place them on the shelf by the windows. The cool air will keep them from getting soggy. I thought of my father and the future of Hood and Associates. I did not complain, even when Mrs. Baker asked me to open the windows a little wider. And I had to move all of the trays one at a time so that I could reach over the shelf and jerk all the windows open a little wider. I did not complain. Thank you, said Mrs. Baker as the school clock clicked at 12:30 and the classroom began to fill and Danny Hupfer came to punch me on the shoulder because he thought the cream puffs might be for us, which they weren't. He figured that out when Mrs. Baker told us to take our Mathematics for You and Me books, line up by the door, and then head to Mr. Samowitz's class. Let me tell you, it's hard to care much about set theory when there are 12 trays of brown, say it with me, brown, light, perfect cream puffs cooling deliciously on the shelf back in your own classroom. 12 sets of cream puffs divided by 23 kids plus Mrs. Baker meant half a set of cream puffs for every person in that room. And don't think we weren't all figuring out that same equation. And don't think we weren't all worrying that Mr. Samowitz's homeroom class, who had walked past us with English for You and Me in their hands, was trying to get those same hands on our cream puffs. So you might want to rewind this and try to figure out that equation. But they didn't. And when we came back in after set theory, the cream puffs were still there, cooling in the circulating air, coming in beneath the clean lower windows. But Mrs. Baker acted like the cream puffs weren't there at all. And I suppose that in the end, it didn't really matter that they were there. They may as well have been over with the wives of Vietnam soldiers at St. Adalbert's already, for all the chance we had of getting one. When 1:45 came, half the class left, and Danny Hupfer whispered, "If she gives you a cream puff after we leave, I'm going to kill you." Which was not something that someone headed off to prepare for his bar mitzvah should be thinking. Bar mitzvah, I wonder what that is. When 1:55 came and the other half of the class left, Mary Lee whispered, "If she gives you one after we leave, I'm going to do number 408 to you." I didn't remember what number 408 was, but it was probably pretty close to what Danny Hupfer had promised. Even my T looked at me with narrowed eyes and said, "I know you're home," which sounded pretty ominous vocabulary. But I knew I was safe. It was just as likely that President Lyndon B. Johnson himself would walk into the classroom as Mrs. Baker would give me a cream puff. Actually, though, someone did come to the door after everyone had left. It wasn't President Johnson. It was a 5th grader from Camillo Elementary. He was carrying a box. "There you are, Charles," said Mrs. Baker. "Did you get them all?" "I think so." "From Mr. Petrelli's class and Mr. Samowitz?" Charles nodded. "And did you remember Mrs. Harknett downstairs?" "Yes. And Mr. Ledema?" "I got them all," Charles said. "Thank you. You may put them here on the desk." Charles put the box on Mrs. Baker's desk. He looked once at me, kind of sadly, I thought, then left, brushing his hands off. Chalk dust fell from them. "Mr. Hood," said Mrs. Baker, "recent events have led the junior high school teachers to conclude that we need to be keeping our chalkboard erasers much cleaner." So think about that. Doug Switek's brother pounds erasers off his head, makes his hair all white, puts chalk into his teeth, runs around like he's a wolf man. And because of that, Halling has to. So I asked Charles to gather them from the classrooms and bring them here each Wednesday. She gestured toward the box on her desk. "Would you take care of them, please?" If there ever was a time to complain, this was it. I walked over and looked into the box. There must have been 30 erasers in there. White with 6 weeks worth of chalk. This was really the time to complain. But I thought of the future of Hood and Associates. I picked up the box of racers. "I'll be in the ditto room," said Mrs. Baker. Just swell, I thought. And that is where we're going to stop today. So, went over a little bit over 20 minutes, but I do want to let you know, like, think about this whole first section of the book. If you want to leave a comment about where we might be going, a prediction, he's got to go down and pound erasers. Oh my gosh, so many erasers. And of course, he's not complaining because his dad is worried that he's going to lose the job. All right, we will pick up with part 2 of October tomorrow. Good job today, kiddos. On to the next.